Good afternoon in New York and the Americas. Good evening in Europe, Ukraine, Israel, and Africa. And welcome whatever time of the day or night for all who are joining us from all corners of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining our webinar today. This International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma psychohistorical webinar is held in commemoration of the 90th anniversary of Ukraine's victims of Holodomor, 1932 to 33. Ukrainian and international multidisciplinary experts will share their own experiences, examine cumulative and intergenerational effects of this devastating national trauma and its aftermath, and reflect on lessons they have learned. Emphasizing its urgent timeline, the discussion will explore parallels with and meanings of living in the current tragic, traumatizing, dangerous, and weapon of war, dangers and threats in Ukraine and around the world in general, and of using hunger as a weapon of war and subjugation in particular. This webinar would not have taken place without the dedicated work of ICMGLT's Working Group on Ukraine, in particular, its chair, Dr. Irina Frankova, and members, Drs. Mariana Velikodna, Oksana Yakushko, and Orest Tsuvalo, who will place in the chat both the English and Ukrainian versions of Yulia Fedorovsky's film, My Name is Eugenia Sakevich Dallas, about a living Holodomor survivor. And as always, we are grateful to our superb interpreter, Anya Stemkova and Natalia Zaetz. Your moderator, I am a clinical psychologist, victimologist, traumatologist, and psychohistorian. I devoted much of my career to studying, treating, and preventing multi-generational impacts of massive trauma, to victims' rights, to rights of future generations, and to reparative justice. That is, the justice that views the process, not only the outcome, but the moment-to-moment and the totality of relationship of the justice system with the victim, as offering opportunities for and is experienced by the victims as healing and repair. Of course, as you will hear from our presenters, history and its politicization too plays a role in the victims and their descendants' experience of justice for their suffering. My version of psychohistory is related as it is dedicated to articulating history as it is lived, rather than mostly a series of dates and events. Our first speaker is ICMGLT's board member, Andre Laperrière, an expert in international development, populations, displacement, and hunger, with degrees in administration and industrial relations, Canadian Mr. Laperrière worked for over 18 years, mostly with the United Nations, in conflict and post-conflict areas on 3 continents with refugees and internally displaced persons, including in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Haiti, Iraq, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is the first executive director of the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court. Our second speaker, Irina Reva, will provide the Ukrainian context with a Master's of Philosophy. Culturologist Reva Irina as Irina Reva, sorry, is a researcher of the Dmytro Yavornitsky Dnepropetrovsk Natural Historical Museum. She authored the popular scientific books, quote, On the Other Side of Yourself, Socio-Psychological and Cultural Consequences of the Holodomor and Stalinist Repression, and Third Generation Mission, and has compiled a documentary collection of interviews with veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian War, warriors of the Dnipro, values, motivations, meanings. Our third speaker is Dr. Vitaly Agenko, a researcher at the Museum of Ukrainian Diaspora in Kiev. Dr. Agenko works on the project Holodomor as a Historical Trauma, which studies how the experience of original trauma has influenced the development of a cultural memory of the Holodomor. The first results of the project are presented in the chapter entitled Secrets of Death, Life, and Survival During the Holodomor, in the Holodomor and the Origins of the Soviet Man, reading the testimony of Anastasia Lisivets. Fourth, but before that, I will surprise you. I will bring you a surprise gift, I promise. Fourth is Dr. Mariana Velikodna, a Europsy registered psychologist. Mariana is a certified psychoanalyst of the European Confederation of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapies and head of the Psychoanalytic Psychology and Psychotherapy Division of the National Psychological Association of Ukraine. She's a psychoanalyst in private practice in Kiev, Associate Professor of Practical Psychology, Department of Kryvyi State Pedagogical University, and Associate Professor of Psychology Department, Ukraine Sigmund Freud University in Kiev. As I mentioned before, Mariana is a member of the work of the ICMGLT Working Group on Ukraine. Last but not least is Dr. Roman Ketchur, an associate professor and head Department of Psychology and Psychotherapy at Ukrainian Catholic University with 25 years of teaching and clinical experience. Dr. Ketchur is chairman of the board of the Ukrainian Psychotherapeutic University and full member of the European Association of Psychotherapy. He is a training psychoanalyst and supervisor of the European Confederation of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapies, head of the Secretariat and Council of Training Psychotherapists of the Ukrainian Union of Psychotherapists, and president of the Ukrainian Confederation of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapies. We are very honored to have him with us, Dr. Ketchur. We have 2 hours for the webinar. Each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes. Following an interchange among us, I will open the floor to questions and brief comments from the virtual audience. Panelists will then conclude with last words. Please use the chat function and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. Feel free to direct your question to a particular panelist or to the full panel. We begin with André Laperrière, who would provide the global context for this important commemorative webinar. André, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Yael. I'm very honored to be part of this distinguished panel and to talk about the Holodomor and beyond that, possible causes and consequences of tragedies like this. So in terms of the overall context, I thought just to frame the discussion maybe, I wanted to underline the meaning of three different words that are often used in contexts such as the Holodomor. One is hunger, the second is famine, and the third one is genocide. So these are words that are sometimes overlapping, sometimes confused one with the other. So maybe I'll try to just clarify a few words on this. So I have prepared a few slides, which I hope will work. Okay, can I? Yes, seems that it works. Very good. So first, hunger. That's the, yep, okay. This was a map of the world's hunger. Everything that is not blue, so anything that is orange and red, shows where in 2019, just before the pandemic, most of the countries that were so deeply affected by hunger. What was interesting at that time is that we estimated that around 821 million people were affected by at different levels of hunger at that point in time, which was very nice in a way because it meant that the world had achieved about 50% of the progress that was aimed at when the MDGs came up. Unfortunately, with the pandemic and then the subsequent conflicts that took place, we lost a lot of ground on this issue. But anyway, that's the overall global map of hunger. Now, hunger can be caused by a number of things, sometimes natural things. We all remember probably the potato famine, as it was named, whereby in Ireland in the past century or so, a big disease came and affected potatoes, which was one of the main sources of food there. And as a result of this, what you have is, I don't know if you can see the colors down there, but the colors indicate the level of emigration that these different parts of Ireland were affected by. So the number of people that left to go to the US, to Canada, to the UK, and other countries. But as you can see, you had some areas like the ones right here in the Connacht region, where you had up to 1/3 of the population that just emigrated. So famine can be a very nasty beast. Oops, sorry. Now, one thing that is more and more observed is that there tends to be a correlation between famine and war. Not just because famine is often used, as we saw in a previous webinar, as a weapon of war, but it just so happens that war disturbs all the supply chains, plus the intent sometimes of parties involved that may purposely trigger famine as a weapon of war. So what you can see here is only Africa, but nevertheless, you can see in the bigger the circle, the more people are being affected, up to 10 million people. The big circles mean about 10 million people in each of these places that are affected by famine right now. And as a result, I'm sorry, it's in French, but you can see that there are different groups like the Boko Haram, which is causing trouble in that part of Africa. Here around Sudan, there's a civil war. In the Horn of Africa, you have the Al-Shabaab. Yemen, you have other groups. So famine can also be caused by war. That brings us to the Holodomor. Although it dates back now some years, this map shows the intensity of the consequences of the Holodomor. The main difference between Holodomor, I guess, and some of the natural causes in particular that we saw before is that the Holodomor, in the eyes of many, was caused by policies. So bad policies, and to make matters worse, and the enforcement of these bad policies, which aimed at centralizing the production and doing a few other things that the other guests will elaborate on. But as you can see, the red part, the red part that you see in this map of Ukraine shows the population decline in between 1929 and 1933. So you had up to 25% of the population in the center of Ukraine that basically left, died, or disappeared in one way or another. So a significant part of the population was just gone. And as you could see, some may bring some bad memories to many because people were so much starving. They were trying to flee to go to other places where they could find something to eat. That's how bad the situation was at that time. Now, when you talk of a man-made famine, whether it is by error or by purpose, oftentimes you start talking about using words such as genocide. So I thought of putting that clarification. That's how the United Nations defines genocide in the United Nations Genocide Convention. It says basically that to qualify for genocide, there should be 5 acts qualify as a genocide. One is if somebody tries killing members of a group, that can be considered as genocide. Second, they might be causing them serious bodily or mental harm. So even though they may survive, but in a bad condition, that also qualifies as genocide. Imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group also qualifies as genocide. Preventing births also. And last but not least, it might even sound familiar nowadays, forcibly transferring children out of the group. So the whole purpose being to do efforts to make the group shrink and, if possible, disappear. So that's really the spirit behind genocide. Now, unfortunately, not all countries yet recognize the Holodomor as genocide, but it's coming. The countries you see in blue, they have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide, and more are joining now. So hopefully, we will get a greater part of the world to acknowledge this terrible tragedy. So my last word is Holodomor, never again. That's the way it should be. So these are just a few words to sort of give you the overall context, and I tried to clarify the distinction between hunger, famine, and genocide. I hope this is helpful to start the discussion. Thank you, Yael.
Thank you very much, Andre, for giving us some of the global picture and the focus on definitions that might help the discussion. Our second speaker, Irina Reva, will provide the Ukraine context. Irina, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. And now let me try and show my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes. Beautiful.
So my intervention is about the Holodomor as genocide and as a historical trauma for the Ukrainian society. And actually, I'd like to start by saying by presenting the overall context, the location where that happened. That's the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. losses, human losses, 3.9 million dead and 600 unborn. Organizers of the artificial famine were the communist authorities of the USSR, executors, implementers. That was the party vertical hierarchy, and also citizens involved in the continuum of coercion. I would like to highlight this term, and those were local people and also mobilized those mobilized from the territory of the Russian Republic. So in my presentation, I will try and describe some patterns what our citizens had to undergo in the situation of the Holodomor. And I believe that we cannot explore a Holodomor without taking into account preconditions, the background of our society, what happened in 1918 through 1922. I'm speaking about the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. This is where I live. This is where I explored the documents, and we know about 100 names of leaders of the Ukrainian anti-communist and anti-Russian movement in this period of time. So there was, in this territory, there was a certain resistance, certain will of people. However, this insurgent spirit was oppressed, and as of 1920, there were more than about 1.2 million soldiers of the Red Army in the territory of Ukraine, of which only a bit more than 10% were ethnic Ukrainians. Also, I'd like to emphasize that the experience of hunger, artificial hunger, we had that in the period of 1921-23. We already had this experience. On the right, you can see the map where we see that after the start of collectivization, there were protests. Soviet special services counted about 4,000 protests of residents of rural areas, where about 1 million people participated. That's important if we try to understand the experience and the background of those events. One of preconditions of the Holodomor, which significantly changed the lifestyle of peasants, was collectivization, the forced collectivization. That was developed by authorities, introduced by communist authorities in order to gain control over the peasants, and that was more than 80% of the Ukrainian population. Those people lived quite an independent life. They could provide for themselves. Collectivization was forced, and we have a lot of testimonies, documents that describe those extreme methods that were used, like torture, repression, that was used to coerce peasants. But most heavily affected were richer peasants. They were referred to by the authorities as kurkuls. That was the most influential population group. Often these people organized those protests, and as a result, they became the main target of those repressions. They were deprived of their property, their assets, together with their families. They were deported, and leaders of those protests could be executed or imprisoned. So if we read memoirs, if we talk to the next generation of those people, they said that their ancestors that they felt robbed and actually depressed. And this is a photo of one of my ancestors who was deprived of his property. Next, at the peak, at the climax of that event of Holodomor, people were suffering of hunger. And in 2019, we had a chance to record memories of people born in 1921 through 29. They are now quite elderly people. And we asked a lot of questions to them, including their experience of Holodomor. So when they talked about those events, they often cried. We could see that even though a lot of time has passed, they still have traumatic and heavy feelings about that. I also would like to emphasize that in those memoirs that have been published, quite often they describe situations of tragic experience of parents who witnessed their children die, and they could not prevent that. On the left, you can see a photo of one of authors of those memoirs. And that's quite an interesting element of learned helplessness. And the 14-year-old author of these memories. So back in that time when he was 14 during collectivization and Holodomor, and he could see how his father, while he was quite authoritative and proactive, but then he fell victim of torture, and he was deprived of all the assets, and he no longer could trust efficiency of his decision making. And then when he saw his children die of hunger and his wife also suffered a lot, so he just fled. He just left all of this responsibility, all of this burden behind. And thus the 14-year-old boy had to undertake the responsibility. And he managed to contact some relatives in Donbas region who were members of the Communist Party, and he got some food to rescue his mother. That's the story. And I would like to also mention that during Holodomor, peasants had limited opportunities to travel. As we know, they had no right to travel abroad to cross the border of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Often villages were surrounded by the units, armed units, so they could not really flee and rescue themselves, those people. And here, Andrea, you mentioned moving children from one group somewhere else as a sign of genocide, and that was very widespread in the times of Holodomor, because there were a lot of children who had no parents, who were in orphanages. Sometimes even parents brought those children, they left them in open markets or somewhere to rescue them, for those children to be admitted to the orphanages. But at the same time, while these children got some help, they also, to a great extent, felt victim of propaganda.
At present, we have the exhibition dedicated to Holodomor in our museum, and the Tatiana Maximenko lost all her family in 1933, but she was raised in the orphanage, and all her life she was recalling Stalin, who as if saved her life. And these are very demonstrative cases. And as for another trauma, and I would like to emphasize that, and this was the subjectivation of those executors of the Holodomor. Quite often, these were either people who have been brought from the cities, the workers. These were the teachers, village teachers, students who were engaged in collecting the grain. And it was a coercive process. And quite often they actually were contradicting their own values and their own consciences. And quite often they were committing suicides. And our society in particular lives with the part of this trauma. And quite often the posterity of these people were telling, for example, my mother, prior to her death, she actually was dreaming and horrible dreams about the people from whom she was depriving from grain. And this is an awful trauma. And this totalitarian machine is not a subject, but an object of violence. And this trauma is not worked on this society, in our society. At our exhibition, one person told a story about her grandmother. She was part of the team which was confiscated the grain from the villagers, but there were quite a lot of people of those. And it's very difficult to really work on this aspect. And one of the problems of the memory about Holodomor is the attempt to silence this history officially. And here you can see a document. The prosecutor of one of the regions was accused of giving the report about the deaths due to the famine and due to the starvation. But all this information was classified. And in the families, quite often, people were silencing these issues, and the parents were afraid to talk about it and to tell their children. Or some people say that in the families, sometimes they were discussing these issues, but they were not allowed to talk about it outside homes and outside their families. And let's make the conclusions. Holodomor actually was the attempt to artificially transform the society. You can see here just a teapot, which is made out of the chalice which was stolen from the church. And I think this is a metaphor about the Ukrainian society which happened then. And one of the consequences is they learn the helplessness. It's just the inferiority complex. And people, when they are recalling Holodomor, compare them with the insects who are eating grass, with the animals. And this is lack of trust to the people who people can find around themselves. And also that was the lack of interest in the national interests. And this is the horror about the famine, and this manifests itself during the war as well. And people are not prepared to self-actualize. And then the Holodomor was followed by the repressions of 1937, 1938, and the other and further periods in the Soviet history. So I believe that we have to review this process as a comprehensive one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. If you would move the thank you very much. Very painful knowledge we are getting. Our third speaker, as you remember, is Dr. Vitaly Ogienko. Vitaly, please, the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important webinar. In this short presentation, I will tell you a little about my project, titled Holodomor as a Historical Trauma, in which I try to look at the Holodomor and its consequences as a trauma process in historical perspective. First, I'll formulate my main idea behind the project and my main objective. Then I'll briefly address my method of achieving this objective. Then I'll move to the conclusions. And finally, I will reflect on the Holodomor trauma in general. But now let me start my slides. Okay. The underlying idea is simple. I believe that Holodomor is so special that it can tell us about historical trauma as such, its mechanisms, and even healing strategies. But why the Holodomor is so special and different from other traumas? Because of two reasons. Except probably the Great Chinese Famine of 1959-1961 and the Cambodian genocide of 1975-1979, at least in 20th century, there were no such disasters where such a vast number of people, approximately 4 million people, died from hunger. But specificity is that these people died being in a psychological and physiological state of immobilization. I borrowed this term from an American neuropsychologist, Stephen Porges. Of course, you know about fight and flight or mobilizational defensive strategies. Fight and flight is a psychological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived harmful event, attack, or threat to survival. In other words, when we find ourselves in life-threatening situations, our only available responses are either to fight the source of a threat or escape from it. Fight or flight response ensures survival by initiating mobilization, which is associated with increased metabolic activity, cardiac output, and muscle tensions. But Porges argued, and now it is fully accepted by the scientific community, that there is a third option, and this third option is immobilization. Immobilization is a neurobiologically adaptive and effective response to a situations where danger cannot be avoided or mitigated. It not only conserves energy, but also enables victims to minimize physical injury and painful suffering by immobilizing and dissociating themselves without fighting back. The immobilization strategy effectively shuts down everything unnecessary for immediate survival, including social behavior and sexual receptivity. It nearly blocks social engagement, empathy, and support, ultimately leading to social isolation. Once this system takes over, other people as well as social roles, common sense, and morality cease to matter. The mouse on this picture is not dead. It is immobilized. So, the story of Holodomor is a story about immobilization. Ukrainians who were dying from hunger could not avoid it. So, some of them who severely starved progressed from mobilization to immobilization, which conserves energy and minimizes suffering. This is an important conclusion because, as Stephen Porges, Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, Gabor Mate, and many others suggest it is exactly mobilization and immobilization, or using other terms, arousal or under-arousal or hyper-arousal and freeze that cause and prolong trauma. So my idea is that the Holodomor and actually every other historical trauma is provoked by a combination of mobilization and immobilization defensive strategy. which in every case of trauma is unique. Accordingly, the primary task of researcher is to study this combination. The second Holodomor unique feature is that for the Ukrainian peasants, their work in collective farms was tantamount for survival. Actually, Stalin's main goal was to force Ukrainian peasants to work free for the state. Another term is slave labor. For example, for Jews in ghetto or Cambodians during genocide of Red Khmers, it was the same. And when Stalin achieved these goals, after several years of fierce Ukrainian resistance and genocide, he decided not to kill all Ukrainians. At the time, for this, he needed only to continue own policy for several months. He loosened the grip on the starving people and initiated various forms of assistance, which were enough for survival. Certainly, it was done on the condition of total surrender. For the survivors, it was the best deal as well, because at the time, fight and flight defensive strategies completely failed, and immobilization could preserve only some time to prolong life. Only death waited for the Ukrainian nation. So when the chance of survival appeared, the Ukrainians opted for the life. First of all, because it was determined by biology. If on the one side is obedience, working without pay and abandoning the former way of life and hopes and plans for the future, but on the other life, the body always chooses life. Thus, the survivors accepted the perpetrator's policy and internalized the new survival strategy of total submission and work without pay, not only due to the coercive and violent policy of killing by famine, but also because only this new strategy offered them a chance of survival. From this perspective, work in kolkhozes, or actually slave labor, was nothing else but a survival strategy accepted both consciously and unconsciously by the victims. You can read in detail about my approach in the book The Holodomor and Origins of the Soviet Man, reading the testimony of Anastasia Lisovets. It consists of two parts. The first part comprises a memoir written by an Ukrainian school teacher, Anastasia Lisovets. If you're looking to read something about Holodomor in the first person, this memoir is the best choice. Moreover, the translation made by an Ukrainian translator, Laperrière, and Professor Alexander Motyl at Rutgers, New York University, is very good. Second part of the book is actually my research. We designed it as a commentary to the memoir. So, what are the conclusions? First conclusion is that mobilization and immobilization, for me, is sort of a binary system which allows to decipher the original traumatic experience in scientific terms, which later can be much more easily applied according to the different scientific tasks. Juxtaposition of starvation, death, immobilization, and historical event of the Holodomor is at the core of my research. The crucial role of immobilization in the Holodomor is important by itself, as it sheds light on why representation of the Holodomor as a dark, ominous, and devoid of any movement, as seen in drawings created by the Ukrainian school students on slide. It remains unclear how the students came to depict such images, whether through exposure to media or unconscious channels, or most probably through both. Nevertheless, these drawings accurately portray immobilization. Therefore, they are historically precise. The creators of these drawings evidently carry some form of trauma, whatever you mean under this term. I define two groups of survivors. Those who get out from the starvation being in state of mobilization, it was absolute majority, and those who was in a state of immobilization. Usually researchers do not define various groups of survivors. Next, conclusion. The Holodomor ended up when survivors accepted the will of perpetrators and completely gave up. I do not consider historical trauma of Holodomor in terms of traumatic event which has consequences, but rather I see it as having many intertwined lines that constantly change themselves, but preserve some original nature. And the scientific task consists of finding how these lines changed and transformed. The tree on the picture represents trauma, which happens somewhere in the soil and then grows in the root, which later transform and transmit into the branches. In order to better understand trauma, the researcher should find out and study probably tens of such lines from the root to the branches and leaves. Okay. And finally, what we can say about the Holodomor trauma in general. My research is in progress, so any conclusions are preliminary and limited. But there are some conclusions. First, the fact that survivors accepted the will of perpetrators sort of willfully because there were no other chance to survive should have own consequences on their life afterwards. Second, many survivors continued to experience arousal and underarousal as a result of being in a state of mobilization or immobilization during the Holodomor in their later lives. The Holodomor was used by authorities to shape the emerging Soviet identity with success. Many survivors became truly communist because they adopted the lessons they were taught. Trauma of the Holodomor has primarily a social nature. It was generated by a huge violence, by enormous psychological power, but then recreated itself in social terms. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vitaly. Of course, we already ordered your book for our library. I would like to share with everyone that the ICMGLT library aims at having every related book to multi-generational legacies of trauma in every related disciplines. So when you, and of course films as well. So not only your book, Vitaly, but and not only the film that Orest promised, I shared with everyone, but we depend on each one of you to check our library and make sure that everything that should be there is there. And talking about that, I promised to interrupt this very painful webinar, but very important for our learning history and our learning from history. You see this beautiful little book. I would like to read a poem from our deeply admired friend, Dr. Boris Khersonskis, and his wife, Lyudmila book, The Country Where Everyone's Name is Fear. Boris' poem that I would like to read to you in the translation to English by Katie Faris and Ilya Kaminsky is entitled They Printed in the Medical History, and it focuses on part of what my contribution to the field of trauma has been, which is the conspiracy of silence about the trauma that ubiquitously follows traumas, particularly when they are politically or socially determined. So, as I said, the name of it is the conspiracy of silence after the trauma that ensures the lifelong impacts of the trauma on the directly suffering generation and its transmission from generations to generations in the future. Here is a poem they printed in the medical history. They printed in the medical history. There was no Holodomor. It was the stable delusion of Anna Mikhailenko, a teacher of Ukrainian literature. For 7 years, she was in a special psychiatric hospital. It was a hybrid hospital, a madhouse and a prison. It was the time of hybrid hospitals. Now it's time of a hybrid war. 7 years in a biblical phrase. Quotes, and Jacob served Laban 7 years for Rachel because he loved her. 7 years. Rachel calls for her children. She can't calm herself because they don't exist. Mariana, the screen is yours, my dear.
Thank you, Yael. Thank you both for the poem and for this webinar. My question is, why is it so hard to talk about Holodomor? Why the conspiracy of silence? And this question arose from my clinical practice as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. And in psychoanalysis, patients usually have enough time, counted in years, enough to talk about different traumatized experience they get in their individual lifeline, and also they usually talk about different traumas of their families. And interestingly, as I observed, many of my patients were more willing to talk about deportations, about Holocaust, about Babin Yar, about imprisoning of their relatives, about forcible displacement, about their ancestors who were Soviet authorities, and so on. So many topics were covered, but almost never they talked about Holodomor. And I asked myself why, because I knew that it was widespread within the country, and I knew that it affected many families. And I started to make a literature review to find some other evidence, because I wanted to understand, is it just my observation? Maybe something is about me. My patient don't want to talk about me, but others maybe talk about it. And later I found a lot of papers that also report very low percentages of people who retell these stories within their families about what happened during Holodomor years. And later I tried to make some psychoanalytic studies, applied study, to discuss this evidence in psychoanalytic approach. And you may find all these points I will cover today in my paper published in 2020. It is published in Ukrainian but for our English-speaking audience, I may assure you that you may refer to this one if you want to cite anything I will say today. Okay, I will not cover all research that I found on this topic. We have many. We have research about, for instance, PTSD symptoms in descendants of Holodomor survivors, about what words people avoid in their everyday speaking, and so on. But I want to show you one research conducted by my colleagues Victoria Gorbunova and Vitaly Klimchuk in 2020. This research is published in Canadian Journal. You may find it in English. See below the reference to it. They invited to participate in online survey people who lived, whose families lived in Holodomor impacted territories. And among this group, 45% informed they lost at least one family member. 79% mentioned life-threatening suffering of neighbors or distant relatives, and 30% reported that the families starved without danger to life. And only 4% cited an absence of any kind of suffering. And what was interesting, that only 16% of participants whose ancestor lived in Holodomor area and in the area affected by Holodomor, only 16% reported that they heard the detailed information about it within their families. Only 16%. I believe it is very few. And moreover, within this research, the correlation analysis the Victoria and Vitaly conducted showed that people who lost someone who was not close to them, for instance, neighbor or distant relatives, they were retelling Holodomor-related stories more frequently compared to those who lost someone really close to them. And another result was that people whose suffering was not critical also had a tendency to talk less often. So we see that those who had some threat, but it was not the question of life and death, talked about this, about Holodomor experience less often, and the same people who had close losses. And my aim was to think, using my psychoanalytic experience, what was behind it. And I studied historical literature, sociological data, psychological research as well. And my idea was that at least three components, three aspects should be mentioned as what contributes to the difficulty of talking, remembering, and memorizing as well, metabolizing, recognizing, processing, accepting, mourning, and self-forgiving of Holodomor experience. These are guilt, shame, and psychotic experience, which are specific for this event. And I now want to comment on each of them, what is the exact specific. When we talk about guilt, I want to distinguish three topics of guilt. The first was propaganda of false guilt, that Ukrainians are guilty for the Holodomor. This propaganda was purposely formed by the USSR authorities. They said that, oh, Ukrainians harvested a bad crop of bread, or they told, oh, they are just lazy and alcoholic. Did you know? Another type of guilt was the guilt for acts and for not acting. Unlike other traumatic events, when it is obvious who is the victim and who is the offender, the Holodomor created a situation in which people faced severe frustration and physiological exhaustion, which artificially awakened in them brutal behavior and urges that under normal conditions they would never manifest it in them. And morally and physically exhausted people went to kill relatives and strangers for food. They could murder someone for compassion. They used cannibalism and committed suicides. And these types of guilt is guilt for acts is a guilt when the roles of victims and perpetrators are mixed, and it is a big obstacle to accept this experience. When I say about guilt on non-acting, I mean also the experience when you could not do anything to save your children, to feed someone, and so on. It also could affect the possibility to share these stories to future descendants. And the third one, which is more specifically to think in psychoanalytic approach, is the guilt for fantasies and wishes. The death of relatives can be perceived unconsciously as the result of fratricidal and patricidal fantasies, which were extremely increased due to the hunger. Why don't you feed me? Or why do I have to share my food with you? Oh, I wish I had no brother to share the food with him or her. And when in such a situation with such fantasies, this brother indeed die, the guilt for these fantasies and for these wishes also can affect this experience, because in unconscious we can believe that it was us who killed them. When we talk about shame, again, it was also a propaganda image of Ukrainians as lazy and alcoholics. And we can see that Holodomor was an act of purposeful dehumanization, which resulted in harm of human dignity. And Irina Reva today highlighted this problem that many Holodomor survivors in later years, when they described their experience during Holodomor years, they compared themselves with livestock or dogs or skeletons and ghosts or bugs. They described that people were dirty and naked, and the shame of being or behaving like an animal also can prevent discussing Holodomor to share these stories. One more problem is consequent identity betrayal, because Holodomor did not actually stop after 1933. The following years was still half-starved, and Ukrainians, as historians say, expected new Holodomor soon, and even prepared coffins for themselves in order to be buried, not like an animal, during the next step of Holodomor, or the next Holodomor. You can find in works of Alexander Dovzhenko that 8 years after this Holodomor, Ukrainians began to abandon their language, national traditions, and their identity. Of course, identity betrayal was logical to survive in face of further steps of the genocides of Ukrainians. So it was, we can understand that it was good to save their lives, but after in further decades, and especially in in time of independent Ukraine, these stories may sound like stories full of shame that your relatives betrayed your Ukrainian identity. And the last one, what I wanted to say, the same for relatives who became collaborators with Holodomor organizers, or shame for those who went crazy, ate children, and so on. And this last point is especially important due to the fact that until this moment, so far, the organizers of the Holodomor and their collaborators have not been accused and punished. And it is it allows to keep it in secret, and in societal meaning it is a secret, and in meaning of family secret, when you never know exactly. You can feel something, you may hurt something, but you can't be sure what was there, because many people who survived survived because they had relatives who were collaborators. It is a very painful truth for many. And the last one is psychotic experience. We should understand that these years were the years of continuous attack on reality, or attacks on links in Beyond's terms. Imagine the workers of the collective farms get a good harvest, but they are left with nothing and are forced to continue work on this farm. Many of them fall dead right on the field and remained there because their colleagues had no strength, physical strength, to take them from the fields. And these colleagues still had to cultivate these fields. In the situation of exhaustion, stress, physical pain, and perversive logics, because they often face the statement that there's no Holodomor, what you're talking about. And people had to share these interpretations and also comment, oh yes, we had a bad harvest this year, which was the lie. And also they should say, oh, we need to save the beets, but beets was not a problem. And in many cases, we have reports of delusion, hallucinations, and mad acts, including cannibalism, but also reality looked like a nightmare. So when you are in this process, when you see something, you feel something, but you should behave like you don't see anything and you don't understand anything, and you should say something opposite to this reality. It is a difficult state of mixed worlds, and after that, in further descendants of Holodomor survivors, we can also feel this like uncertainty. After Holodomor, you never know exactly, you're not confident of what was the fact and what was the dream and what was your delusion. My experience when I wrote this paper, I often felt some like derealization. I was not confident. Am I right to combine these facts? Do I have a right to talk about that, and so on? I have authored a proliferation of papers. I never felt like that compared to this topic, because I have in my family died people who died because of Holodomor, and this may make the descendants especially vulnerable to this USSR propaganda that, oh, don't make me laugh, there was no genocide of Ukrainians. We just had some problems with provision in all republics. It was just a bad year, and so on. When you are not confident what were the facts and what exactly was happening, you are like sensitive sensitive to denial. And another moment, you see it on this slide, I found some observation that there were more common shifts to psychotic functioning without further recovery among women, because women are expected that they are responsible to find food and to feed their families. And for women who faced that they could not feed their children and their families in general, it was especially a painful experience. Okay, I also added a slide in the last moment after Andrea's presentation. It is a document. As you know, several years ago, KGB archives in Ukraine were opened, and now historians can use them and find any information they want to check as documents. This is a death certificate. You see the village Kobzivka. You see that it was a female, age 8 years, nationality Ukrainian, and in the bottom you see the cause of death, Ukrainian. I don't know if we would need any other evidence that it was a genocide. I also want to invite our international audience to see some movies about Holodomor. These three are highly recommended. You may start from the movie of Mr. Jones. In Ukraine, it was translated as Цена правды, the cost of truth. After all these Soviet events, when truth was too often replaced by some false historical stories, narratives, we value the truth very much. And also, I want to show you the book, which was just published a week ago. It is really very thick and hard. It is a book with documentation only about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Only one region in the country has just hundreds of documents about how exactly Holodomor was implemented. And you may find there even protocols of tortures similar to what we saw in Bucha and Izum in current war. I added the name of the author of this book, Natalia Romanets, and her email, because if someone knows any publishers who would be willing to translate this book and publish it in English, please reach Natalia. She will be happy to spread, to share this knowledge to the international audience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Of course, all these books and films go immediately to our library and to the media section. It also occurs to me that on the whole, we should have a special webinar on survivor guilt and on shame for now too. In our library, you can find my own work on the conspiracy of silence that we would look at, hopefully, in the future. Dr. Ketcher, we've had such brilliant presentations. You have very hard work to put it all together. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you very much for this comment. And I had to summarize as far as I understood, but actually I did not exactly what I would have to summarize, but actually I have prepared a couple of things to say to be much more flexible, and I will try to comment. So my report is Ukrainian identity and transgenerational trauma. I will try to understand, and I will try to actually describe it from the scientific point of view. And I would like to maybe give a couple of examples which will give us actually a scientific background of multigenerational trauma. When we are talking about the genetic memory, we have quite often we have a lot of distortions here, and we have to think about these scientific facts which are known today, and they are sufficient for us to be able to transmitting the trauma through the memory of the generations. And there are the mechanisms which give us an opportunity to discuss it. And this is neurobiologist, psychiatrist Eric Kendall, American, and his parents, by the way, are from Ukraine, and his father was born 70 kilometers away from the city where I live, from Lviv, and he was born in Vienna, and he was hiding from the Nazis, and then he moved to the United States, and there he was studying literature. And then after the death of his professors, he met with Anton Kris and his wife, and he started to work as a psychoanalyst. And it was necessary to graduate from the medical school to do that. And he fell in love with neurobiology, and he actually started to work as a psychoanalyst, and to develop it. He did not less than Sigmund Freud did, because he, by his neuropsychological research, he proved the fact that psychic interaction really has an impact on the genes, depending on what experience we have in the relations, and especially in early childhood and during the adult life also. And certain genes become active and some are being blocked. So psychic interaction does not change our DNA, but it changes the proactiveness of our DNA. And let's move forward. The scientific substantiation. The research of 2013 demonstrated that the response to certain issues might be inherited, like, and a number of the experiments with the rats has been carried out when the rats have been inhaling acetone, and this effect was transferred to their children and the grandchildren without the direct contact. And we can see that the traumas which actually is based on two factors, pain and smell. So the response to the smell, which the animal did not experience of, but actually the ancestors of this animal had this experience, and this response has been transferred genetically. And the animals which have been born as a result of the extracorporeal fertilization. And we have to understand this when we are talking about the transgenerational transfer of the trauma. We are not talking about it in the cultural sense, but we are talking about it through the epigenetic mechanism. And And epigenetics explains the transfer of the response to the stress situations through changing the DNA, which is being transferred through the structure of the DNA, and certain genes start to mutate, and our response to the stress depends on our ability to synthesize certain hormones. Some synthesize more cortisol, and that's why we respond to the stress differently. I want to demonstrate that when we are talking about the impact of such a mass trauma as Holodomor over the human culture, we mean not only the cultural, political, and sociological and demographical aspects and results, but we also have to understand what are the biological factors of that, and the biological factors for such a catastrophe. And let's look at another side of the matter. In Ukrainian villages, we have a tradition. The teachers usually wash the windows before the holidays, twice, 3 times a year in one of the villages. And one of my friends told about it. And in some villages, the people wash windows every Saturday. And this story happened 80 years ago during occupation, during the military Nazi occupation. There was a battalion, located in this village. And there was an officer in this battalion. And he wanted very much actually to live in the clean building. So when he saw that the windows were not washed, he was shooting the people, and that was awful. And these people had to avoid it, so they were washing the windows during the war every Saturday so that they would not be shot. And 80 years ago, the war has been over, but people are still keep up this tradition. The people who suffered from this officer are no more, but this is the story we are going to go back to as when we are talking about the trauma and identity. And this is a quote from Freud. And I think that this is actually a pivot of the Freud teaching. And this quote is from the letter of the letter of Sigmund Freud to his friend Wilhelm Fliess. And he says that our genetic apparatus has been created as the layers, and it is being reconstructed and is being rewritten, and the memory appears several times, and the memory is the psychic, the achievement of the previous life. And I think that characteristic features of psychoneurosis could be explained by the essence of such transformation. And I'm going to translate this text now so that we can understand it. We remember our past depending on what our current situation is, and we remember the aspects which create the linkage between the future and the past, so that our past does not contradict our current time. We are rewriting our memory. In other words, we are remembering our past in the context which actually complies with our reality of today. And this is an absolutely normal process of the flexible response of the psyche to the change of the current context. My main hypothesis and my main proposal is the following. psychic apparatus of the nation or an individual psychic apparatus, is in quotes, of the nation or the group could be divided into unchangeable and changeable part, the identity and the creativity which is necessary for development, and to the nucleus of identity, which is not changing. We actually reflect the individual and collective traumas which have been, which people survived. In other words, the identity of these residents of this village includes washing windows once a week. And in other words, the traumas which their ancestors have survived now are part of their identity. And the symbols actually tell us about the traumatic story. And the rituals have to overcome the trauma and simultaneously repeating it, and they symbolize this loop of time. And the ritual gives us a hope to overcome the trauma. And this traumatic experience creates the individual psyche, and it creates the culture. It creates this nucleus, which is not changed, and we call it identity. Identity is the result of traumatization, not traumatic part of our psyche is flexible and it's changing, and it is introduced through the mechanism of rewriting. So the mechanism of rewriting the memory is the mechanism which is part of our non-traumatic part of our psyche. And the traumatic part of our psyche is building our identity. In this moment, we have something like a story about the structure and function, and something spontaneous and creative. We have a story about tradition and about the creativity and about something new, conservatism and liberalism. We have a story about of what our psyche consists of, and our collective psyche consists of, if we can use this metaphor. So the symbols and rituals in our life do the same work as the symptoms and customs and the traits of the history in our individual psyche. And this was a theoretical introduction to understand, for you to understand what I'm talking about and how I'm thinking. Well, today we talked a lot about Holodomor, but for lack of time, I cannot really elaborate on these ideas, which I wanted to share with you, but I would like to be brief. We are talking about the classical trauma, which is about destroying through the genocide, but not only destroying through genocide, but even denying the trauma itself. In other words, this is the history when actually people are being battered and they are not allowed to weep. They don't allow to memorize, to remember, and the only way to survive, this was for the Ukrainian Soviet men. I'm not from that part of Ukraine which survived Holodomor, and and my relatives are from a different part of Ukraine. We never had Holodomor, and we were just watching the situation with horror, and we could not discuss these issues with the survivors and actually with the relatives of the survivors. They said that there was nothing like Holodomor, and they had a very happy Soviet past. And we have here the social context, and the villagers, they were Ukrainian speaking, and the food was concentrated in the city. Those people were fleeing the villages where they were talking Ukrainian and where they could not get any food. And they were dying in the streets, in the parks. And since then, those who were actually sharing this identity and spoke the Ukrainian language, they were always under the threat. And they wanted to identify themselves with those who were controlling situation and who were in power. And they and their posterity became communists, and the majority of those became Russian-speaking people. We have this similar process, which is evolving in the occupied areas of Ukraine. And this history and this story is not completed. The story is continuing in the occupied areas by Russia. At present, the individual who will be wearing Ukrainian national clothes or has a photograph that this person was wearing this Ukrainian clothes is going to be repressed. And we have to remember this when we are talking about the past, because we have to talk not only about what happened in the past, but we have to talk what's going to happen in the future. If we lose this war, the genocide will be applied to Ukraine, and we Ukrainians know that too well. And not to remember about the trauma, then that was the only way to survive. And the memory is being erased, but there is always a fear. And there is mistrust to everybody who is around you. In 1933, the millions of Ukrainians were not able to actually to withstand this death. And for several generations, it was impossible to remember it. And to preserve the internal safety, the psyche has to delete the memories about the catastrophe and not to feel the same painful feelings. And it is very important to understand all the horror of it. And we can move forward only after we actually work on it and process it. And we have to understand the tragic past and to transform the past and to realistically create the future. And this is everything I wanted to share with you with these a couple of minutes which you have given me to speak on this topic. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ketchur, for adding the genetic and neuropsychological dimension. We are now almost complete in terms of multidisciplinariness. Examination of the legacies of Holodomor from history to definitional international law, to psychoanalytic understanding, to genetic understanding, to psychohistorical understanding. This webinar is going to remain a classic, and I hope that we continue this tradition of creating these complex attempts at understanding and wisdom. This is the time of the panel when you may want to comment on each other's or ask each other questions, but please do remember that because of the rich array of knowledge we have received, we don't have too much time, because we must give the audience their place. And part of my problem is that many of the comments are in Ukraine in the chat, so I would need translation to moderate them. So I'm wondering whether any one of you has, or I see Irina Reva, you had a comment or a question, then Mariana. Go ahead, Irina, please. Hey, you have to unmute. Go ahead. Irina, you wanted to speak?
Я хотіла, власне, от прослухати.
After having listened to Mariana's and Roman's presentations, I actually started to reflect, and two ideas struck me. Mariana was saying that the polled, the relatives of the survivors didn't talk much about Holodomor, but Roman expressed a very interesting idea that trauma becomes the source of identity quite often. And it was interesting to me. Well, the following aspect was very interesting for me. Since the war started, the Russian-Ukrainian war started, I was recording the memories of the military servicemen, and it appeared that they were ready to recall the family history. And I understood why. Maybe because then it was the time of, exit from the normal situation. Well, when people live in the comfort zone, and all of a sudden, when they were at the border of life and death, they started to actually look for the senses. And I was asking the questions, and they were answering to understand the experience which they had and consolidate it with the experience which they were getting during the war. And that's why people were quite frank and open on answering these questions. And that was very interesting. And one of the teachers of history and law in the higher educational institutions, when I asked him about Holodomor, he told me, oh, yes, something like that was told to me. And he said, now I'm going to call my friends and find out. And he was calling and then relating some details of this story. And I was impressed actually he was never thinking about it, in spite of the fact that he was a teacher of history. And he was fighting in the brigade number 3, and he was fighting in the airport of Donetsk. So he had very, very traumatic experience during the war. But maybe people have to get real mature to be able to reflect on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina, for acknowledging the existential aspect of Holodomor. And of course, when we speak about multi-generational and the time dimension. And for your insightful comment that perhaps often we need time and perspective to be able to reflect, and not immediately within the experience. And you saw that some of the presentation indeed spoke about identity with relation to trauma. So this is extremely important. Go ahead, Mariana. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. I haven't been speaking Ukrainian today, so I would like to speak in Ukrainian. Good evening. And after the presentation of Mr. Roman, I've been thinking about this issue, and I emphasized the component of time. Unfortunately, when we are talking about the Holodomor, the time plays against us because we can get the information only from the survivors and actually the posterity of the survivors, because the historical material was falsified. Children who was who was born in 1935, actually they were given in the birth certificates with the date of birth of 1933, and they wanted to prove that a lot of children were born in 1933, and that this meant that there was no Holodomor. Andrea today was showing us the map, which demonstrated Holodomor, and Khmelnytsk Oblast is not marked on that map, and the sister of my grandmother died of famine, of starvation in that region, and they were distorting the information. They were, unfortunately, it was mentioned today that the archives of the KGB were open, and now historians started to use those archives proactively. But unfortunately, this information, which is difficult to understand, and it is necessary to get a lot of evidence so that we can verify that information and to put it together and actually write the story and history and story about those events with no contradictions.
Andrea? Irina, you wanted to go ahead, Irina. Sorry, Andrea.
I just wanted to comment what Mariana said. Well, I was working with the documents in our Oblast archive, and I found a lot of documents which could be credible. We can trust them because even well, if we look at the language in which they're written with the mistakes and errors, we can see that they were not completely and fully censored, and they were writing the information which they got during interrogations. And these are very interesting materials which might help us in psychological research. Well, and for example, as for the cannibalism, the cases of cannibalism, yes, there are a lot of documents, relatively many documents, where we have the information about the cannibalism, and the children were the victims of cannibalism quite often. And there is really a problem emerges. This experience is impossible to actually project on the experience of a normal individual. Mariana, you were saying that people don't want to talk about this experience, but it's impossible to talk about it. And these are absolutely different status of psyche, and they do not actually transposed to the cases of cannibalism. There were stories about cannibals who have eaten the children, and after that they died quite soon, and that was the extreme status of the body and of the organism when people simply could not survive it. And these phenomena of changing of the psyche also are related to what Lyudmila Yuryeva said, our psychologist, psychiatrist, who is quite well known in my city in Dnipro. She was saying that in 1930s, the statistics of suicides was closed, and only in 1980s they have opened the statistics of the suicides in the Soviet Union. And maybe this is also a very important aspect.
Yeah, that sounds like the beginning of another book. Extremely important to elaborate on. We might want to have a special webinar on that. Thank you for the thoughtfulness and foreseeing how the nourishment, the multidisciplinary nourishment, really creates richness of thinking that we wouldn't have otherwise. Go ahead, Andre, please.
Thank you very much. I would just like to build a little bit on what Mariana has said earlier. You made me think of sort of a statement that my late mother used to say. She used to say that behind any difficulty lies an opportunity if you know how to look for it. And so as much as the whole experience of the Holodomor is terrible because of what happens, the good side of this is that it's relatively well documented. So while we still have some people that are live witnesses of what happened, plus all the documentation there is on it, I think this is a gold mine of information for us to collectively better understand this phenomenon. The reason why I'm mentioning that is that before this presentation, I dug a little bit in the UN archives as to how many genocides have occurred over the last, let's say, 300 years. I found over 100 of them, all over the place. So there's definitely a need for us to collectively better understand what causes that, and better how we can prevent these from happening again. And maybe the Holodomor is a good test area that could allow us to enhance our knowledge about these terrible events and avoid them in the future.
That's very important. It brings to mind, you know, the upcoming United Nations meeting on the status of women, whose topic this year is hunger. And Andre, I volunteered you to organize a panel on that. So don't go to sleep on anything until we finalize this. The only problem to here is that it's going to be in person in New York. So those of you who are very interested in coming, and I can't think of a better webinar than today. We will all have to stay in touch and talk about that. Okay, because this panel, it brings so much wisdom into the discussion. Vitaly, I'm wondering, you didn't put your hand up, but I'm sure you had many thoughts during the panel presentation. Would you please share with us some of them? You have to unmute, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. For me, it was very interesting. Yes, many thoughts and many ideas, many comments. For example, I can react on some questions from the chat.
Please, but
Okay.
ask me, will you please tell me what the questions are, because with all my love for you, I don't read Ukrainian. Go ahead.
It was a question in English about forgetting, about concept of forgetting.
Okay.
Forgetting, for me, it is a very complicated concept because it can be related even to politics or to culture and to psychology as well. Yes, forgetting can be forceful or willful forgetting about something. And maybe it is a more useful notion as amnesia. And speaking about Holodomor in historical context, I should tell that in Soviet times, it was total amnesia. It was forceful amnesia inflicted on society by Soviet authority. It was prohibited to speak about Holodomor. But of course, silence, in part, it was generated by means of psychoanalytical mechanisms. The short answer is that amnesia was total in Soviet times. Yes, and it is understandable why people don't like to speak about traumas. In part, it is because of social context, because if society do not acknowledge role of these people, of survivors, and do not acknowledge them as good people, there is no social sympathy about these people in society. Usually people do not like talking about it. It's easy, understandable. It's easy to understand, yes? And
Yeah.
it was question also about crimes, repetition of crimes, current crimes, which now underway and by Russians, and crimes during the Holodomor. And if these crimes traumatize society, Ukrainian society, or maybe they're helpful in something. And my understanding that in part they can be helpful, and in part, of course, they have this traumatic nature, because there's effect of sort of addition or effect of if something bad adds to something bad, and even in terms of memory. Antonio Damasio, for example, wrote about it extensively, that this complex memory formation, memory forms not only because of memories, but because of experience, first of all. Definitely, this memory about trauma can such effect of addition, effect of when something bad adds to something bad, and of course it's bad. But from other side, I think that if we think, for example, about this courage of current Ukrainian society and Ukrainian soldiers against Russian on the front line and in cities, and mobilizing effect of Ukrainian society, it can be initially not very easy to understand why it is, because Ukraine is very traumatized society. There is trauma everywhere here in society, and nobody understands it. And it is not only about Holodomor. Ukraine is very traumatized society, but we have here this courage, yeah, and it's remarkable, and how to understand it. And I think that it can be understood in terms of consequences of past trauma, because maybe Ukrainian sensed something that it can be repeated against this genocide, this atrocity, and they understood it even unconsciously that it can be repeated. And so this courage, as they do not want repetition of this atrocity, is because this reaction. And second, understanding why it can be helpful somehow. It's because it's like rule in physiology, and it's rule that if you if you find yourself under the totalitarian regime, or you controlled by totalitarian regime, usually you are not very good in fighting against oppressor. Yes, because it is power, it is authority, and you can be punished for that. But if you can live in independent society, Ukrainian independent state, in free society, for example, 10, 20, 30 years after he was in totalitarian society, this appear this desire to fight for freedom and such notion. So it is in some terms, it is the consequences for Ukrainians, first of all, to be 70 years in totalitarian society, in authoritarian regime, and then to live 30 years in free society. And I think that this contrast is very important for understanding why Ukrainians now are so fight so well for our own freedom.
Thank you. A lot of what we are talking about is, quote, unimaginable. And I'm very, listening to you, I vividly am reminded of Elie Wiesel's, the Holocaust survivor, chronic concern that we don't have words to describe. It's not included in what we conceive of as how people behave, or what people think, or what people do. And there are many views here. Some of you talk about the conspiracy of silence as an externally imposed issue. Some of you are talking about the internal struggle of expressing. And in my own study, I found 49 ways of not listening in trained psychoanalysts. So this is extremely important. It's humanity. It's not only the shame of the individual, it's the shame of humanity. That humanity itself, in its identity, doesn't provide us with tools. But Roman, please, go ahead.
Дякую.
Thank you. I believe that there is at the moment is very important, and we can talk about what could be expressed and about what happens when we do not have any words to express it. And there is a borderline which has to be described. We do not have words enough to express what is the basis of our identity. We cannot describe it. Well, we simply believe it. And when we can describe it, well, it's like, those windows which are dirty. And this is not part of the identity then, but it's part of the choice. And I think that Vitaly said very well that Ukrainians are fighting. They are struggling. They are fighting because we're not saying simply that the genocide is going to happen, but we've seen it already in Bucha. And we've seen the graves where the majority of the deceased were not the military servicemen, but the civil people. And there were more women than men. We see it and we are fighting against it, but we partially have overcome our trauma already because we started to talk about a Holodomor not yesterday, not today, but we started to discuss it a couple of decades ago. And we have to pay tribute the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, who brought this topic to the limelight. And I was present at the television discussion where he was, and we were discussing the topic of Holodomor there. So this work, which is being done by the Ukrainian intellectuals together with the Ukrainian people, well, has to be reflected. We have to actually work on it and process it and the history which we have inherited. And this gives us a possibility to fight against the invaders. We are people who understood what is Holodomor and they don't want it to be repeated. But should we be just the survivors and the victims of Holodomor, we won't be able to fight against the invasion. And this is a great thing we have to understand. It's like similar to the history of the Jewish people. Should the Jewish people be only the victim of Holocaust, they won't be able to resist, to build their own state, it and to self-actualize itself. The memory of Holocaust should exist, and the memory of Holodomor should exist, but we have to create the area free of traumas. Thank you, but maybe I was talking too much.
This is exactly why the center was born. Thank you. Mariana, you want the last word, eh? Go ahead, darling.
Yes, in the chat, there is a question whether we can see some parallels in what happened during the Soviet times and during the Soviet power, and how they were developing and building the narratives, and how now the Kremlin propaganda during this current war is working, and whether there are similarities. Yes, there are a lot of similarities. And there is a work, Paul and Matthews are the authors of it in 2016. They have analyzed the current Russian propaganda, and they are comparing it with the Soviet propaganda, and they describe how it develops, and they gave a name to it. I will give Fire Horse of Falsehood. So that is like, pouring lies out of the hose. This has nothing to do with the reality, and they actually are pouring it through all the channels, and they don't even tie it with the events which take place. And I think this is very similar to what we were talking about when we were discussing Holodomor, when they are actually telling the lies, and they forge the documents, and they forge the statistics, and this is exactly what happens now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Natalia, your question, and Natalia Churikova, your question, does the present traumatization of the war help heal or re-traumatize? It depends for whom and to whom. In some of the in my own theory, when I speak about differing adaptational styles, which you can also find in webinars on our website, and some of the webinars are translated into Ukraine. So it depends. I want to make just one more touch on one more concept, and to promise Crystal Motz, who is asking us to relate what we learned today about Holodomor to and again, Natalia, to the Holocaust, to the current situation. Crystal, we are already thinking about how to observe the, unfortunately, second anniversary of this war, and we will look and we will examine this question then. And it's very soon. Time goes so fast when there's war and terrible things. And yes, there are many lessons from the Holocaust. Our library is full of those. My own writings are full of those. I want to thank everybody for an amazing webinar. We only get better and better. And promise you that we'll simply continue. There's so much more to learn. All the questions asked are not just for a short answer, and let's respect them that way. I want to thank each one of you who has come and stayed with us, and deeply thank our brilliant presenters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yael. And please send me your paper with 45 ways to not listen.
49.
49. I want to read it,
It
please.
was my doctoral dissertation, 49 ways of not listening. And of course, guilt and shame are part, but there are many other ways. So you and I might want to do something together on that. There's a lot of collaboration right in front of us toward the future. Thank you.
I was going to add that I still feel that there's a lot to learn from this more than 100 genocides that took place over the last 200 or 300 years. It's for me, I was totally amazed to see the sheer number, and the fact that it just keeps on repeating itself. So I think we need to dig into that quite a bit more.
Yeah, and I was reflecting too about how we always say never again. And what you're pointing out is it's ever again.
Yeah.
And that's what we really want to understand, don't we?
Yeah.
Why humanity keeps destroying itself. But so we have a lot more to do. And that's why we created the International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. And we are all welcome. That's what we need to talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you.